Hi everyone, this is Dr. Matt Westbrook and this is my walkaway story. I spent my late teens following in my father's footsteps as a religious right conservative. I kind of come to think of that as shallow conservatism for reasons that I will state in just a moment. But I spent a lot of energy during that time writing letters to the editor of my local newspaper. It was during Clinton's presidency, so I was railing against Clinton's policies, against his extramarital affairs, and I supported Ken Starr's investigation at the time, mostly because I was just appalled at that kind of behavior being in the Oval Office. We still see that kind of behavior by the resident of the Oval Office today, and I'm no less morally appalled by that. But I spent my time as a cultural conservative until I went to seminary just before 9/11. I went to a really mainstream, even very important evangelical Christian seminary in Southern California, and enjoyed my time there. Got my master's degree, but 9/11 hit in the middle of it, and that began to change some of my conservative views, mostly because of the actions of George Bush. Now, I definitely supported dismantling that terrorist network that committed the atrocities on 9/11. But when Bush made his turn to Iraq, it deeply disturbed me because it seemed completely unjustified. None of the terrorists or the terrorist network of 9/11 were in Iraq whatsoever. And the reasons that he was giving the public, that there were weapons of mass destruction and that Saddam Hussein was pursuing nuclear weapons, didn't seem credible to me. I began to read alternative media sources, even beyond the New York Times, which was itself carrying water for Bush as he made his case to the UN for authorization to invade Iraq. As it turns out, those media sources I was reading were in fact correct. There were no weapons of mass destruction. He was not pursuing nuclear weapons. And it was a complete waste of time and money and inflamed the Middle East, inflamed Shiites and Sunnis with ramifications that we are still feeling today and that the region still feels today. A weak Iraq has allowed Iran to march through the northern part of the Middle East to deliver really dangerous weapons to Lebanon and Hezbollah, which are aimed directly at Israel. And in fact, Iran is inflaming the tensions in Syria and causing even more atrocities there. If Iraq was still under the control of Saddam Hussein, as bad as that man was, they wouldn't have that kind of access to the northern Middle East. So those things bothered me. It just felt like Bush was lying. It felt like the minions around him, especially Dick Cheney, it felt like they were lying. And so I began to make a liberal turn at that point. My seminary education also had something to do with it. I did learn, at least from a couple of my classes, that there were alternative ways to thinking besides the conservative viewpoint. But I had only been experiencing that shallow conservatism that I had mentioned. And I call it shallow because it never tapped into that rich intellectual conservative tradition that goes back several hundred years and is really worth engaging if you haven't done so already. One of the ways to do that is to read Thomas Sowell, who covers some of that ground, and to listen to conservative intellectuals and not just people who are opinion makers. And I encourage you to do that. I've been doing that as well as of late. So I began to find that I was very surprised at the way that Christianity and this hyper-nationalism that we were seeing in the aftermath of 9/11, how they formed a kind of synthesis together and created an extra oomph of energy in the support of George W. Bush, and which kind of made it easy for politicians to manipulate, it seemed to me, because they were so the religious right had become so gung-ho for both their faith and their country that they became blinded to any alternative sources of information. That seemed pretty dangerous to me, so I wanted to study that somehow to kind of understand how people work in that fashion. It's not just Americans, this happens all over the world, I would come to learn. And so I wanted to study that further. So I decided to get a degree in sociology and study the sociology of religion. I went to Drew University in New Jersey. It's a very liberal school. It's becoming even more radical than it was when I went. But I was still able to find 4 professors who were serious about engaging in scholarship. They welcomed alternative viewpoints, even though they didn't teach them in their classes. They were respectful and engaging when I wanted to have conversations. I wasn't as liberal as they were, and I had some different perspectives because of my background and upbringing. But they were fair and kind and served my education well, and so I thank them for that. But nowhere on that campus, either in the faculty or in the student body, could you find more than a handful of conservatives. And I don't think there was a single, maybe one conservative faculty on the whole campus. Conservatives were as rare as a blue moon there. That's not that much different from colleges across the country. And since the academy is the intellectual center of the country, it is worthwhile to know that it is completely dominated by leftists who produce the thinkers and the politicians and the lawyers, the doctors and the school teachers of the next generation. So that's something to keep in mind. And secondly, I decided for my dissertation topic to study what's called Christian Zionism, which is Christian support for the state of Israel. It's a global phenomenon, and it turns out the most staunch reporters tend to be Pentecostal and charismatic Christians. Doesn't matter what country you're in. In nearly every country, they seem to be, that was surveyed in a 10-country survey by the Pew Forum on religious life back in 2006. They saw that Christians in every country that supported Israel, and disproportionately so among Pentecostals and charismatics. So I studied Christian Zionism, which also required me to do some field research in Israel. That was an eye-opening experience. And to do a lot of research and reading on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and watching the media and how the media treated the subject. And so I did a lot of that. And I was struck by 2 things that began my, let's call it the exposing the path to which I would eventually walk away from the left. And the first thing I saw was that most of the world is extremely unfair and biased against Israel. And nowhere is this more apparent than in the United Nations and in the region called MENA, which is Middle East and North Africa. That's the mostly Arab or closely affiliated to Arab cultures. Basically, it's the old remains of the Ottoman Empire, which stretched all the way into Spain for a while. In those regions, the bias against Israel is extremely vitriolic and unfair and even devious in the way they try to manipulate public opinion and the way they have captured the UN and hijacked it for anti-Israel purposes. We can go into this in future videos if you're interested, but for now, that's enough to say that I discovered an extreme bias against Israel. The second thing that I found was in non-MENA countries, in other words, outside of the Middle East, the political parties in those non-MENA countries and the leftist population were also extremely biased against Israel. And that goes against the literature a little bit, which said that conservatives, especially religious conservatives, were the most anti-Semitic people in the United States. That literature dominated for a good bit of time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and even up into today for some leftist thinkers. Turns out that isn't true. Christian Zionists actually do love Israel. And they're not trying to gather Israel in the middle, or Jews in the Middle East just for the slaughter. They actually have a strong, heartfelt connection to the Jewish people because the Jewish people are in their Bible. It hasn't always been that way, but it is now. And I discovered that in my research. But finding this anti-Israel bias became as much of a curiosity to me as thinking through the issues around that religious nationalism after 9/11 that I spoke about earlier. How is it that these people can be so vitriolic against this tiny little country in the Middle East, no bigger than the size of New Jersey, and which has become a haven for the Jewish people, where anti-Semitism around the world drives them from their home countries? That, to me, was worth studying as well. And so I've been thinking about these issues since I graduated in 2014 and doing a lot of research. And it's been really eye-opening. But what really turned me away from the left was the election of Donald Trump. I didn't vote for Trump. In fact, in my voting adult age, I voted for 4 different political parties on the right and on the left. And what really surprised me about Donald Trump's election wasn't that he was elected, though that was surprising as well. The most surprising thing was the reaction against Donald Trump's election. I live in Portland, and Portland may not be representative of the rest of the cities in the country, but it isn't far off. The people in Portland went absolutely crazy after Donald Trump was elected. There were riots in the streets. People were throwing Molotov cocktails into Target. They were blocking major bridges into Portland and then throwing large obstacles over the bridges onto the I-5, which is the largest highway and most busiest highway in Oregon. Very dangerous situation. They were setting fire to things in the streets. And the kinds of things they were saying, including the congresspersons from this area, really made me stop and think, this is not a sane group of people. And that's exactly what I told my wife after I reflected on the videos I was seeing. I told her the left has gone completely insane. People have a name for that now. It's called Trump derangement syndrome, and I'm sure most of you have heard of that. But that's what really turned me away from the left. I refused to be associated with that kind of insanity, which seemed destined to destabilize the country, and in fact it has in that time. And I was able to easily trace what I was seeing in these protesters to the influence of the academy, from which I had spent so much of my life, and my adult life, I should say. So, though I didn't vote for Trump, I still decided that I needed to research what was causing this reaction on the left to Trump. And that's what I've been doing for the last couple of years. I've been trying to research leftist social movements beyond just those circling around Israel, but communist movements more generally, Antifa and the anti-fascist movements, other anarchist movements, etc., trying to understand the logic, the appeal, and just generally how people work. So I'd like to, in subsequent videos, share some of what I found with you if you're interested. We'll do it topically. I'll pick some different things that I've learned, some things to help explain what it is that we're seeing. I want to think with you about how we got to this point. I want to look at history with you, not all of history, but just some important parts of history that feed into what we're seeing today. I want to think through how people function and how they work as human beings and what causes them to gather in this kind of movement. It's clear to me in my brief bit of research that I've been doing that the leftist movement we are seeing in the United States has attained a global status. And quite frankly, so has the conservative reaction that we're seeing. Everywhere in the world, you can see, especially in the West, you can see strong conservative backlash against these leftist movements, and the same insanity we see in the United States, we're beginning to see in other countries as well. This deserves our research. This deserves our attention, and we need to have some discussions about this. So if you're interested, subscribe to the channel, and we'll go through this together for as long as you remain interested. Thanks.